These are some facts on the war. It started in 1980 and ended up in 1988. There were over 500,000 deaths. Some of the international actors were Kuwait, United States, France, Saudi Arabia, Soviet Union, and Egypt. First, the United States was neutral, but it ended up supporting Iraq. Supporting Iran, it was Libya, Syria, Israel, North Korea, and China. And the United Nations was also involved in the conflict. There are three things that characterize this war. First, it was excessively long. It lasted 8 years, which is more than the First and the Second World War. Second, it was asymmetrical. Since Iraq had support from bigger nations, it clearly had an advantage over Iran. And third, the use of big weapons like chemical weapons and the attack to third countries, as well as the use of indiscriminate ballistic missile attacks. Identity as a cause of war. Even though this war was mostly about power, there are certain factors of identity that had influence. The first one is that since Iran is an Arab nation and Iraq is Persian, there have always been tensions between them. As well, Iraq is mostly Sunni and Iran is mostly Shiite, which is why there have always existed religious tensions. As well, there is also an ideological difference. Iran was socialist and pro-Soviet, while Iran was anti-socialist and pro-Western. However, these identity differences weren't the main reasons that caused the war, which is why they aren't that important in this conflict. Let's talk about greed and grievance as a cause of war. As Stuart Inkin mentions, horizontal inequalities in economic, social, political, or even cultural dimensions between culturally defined groups are a powerful cause of civil wars. On the other hand, as Collier Inkin mentions, greed, in the sense of economic motivation, is an important factor propelling violence in a great many civil wars. We could say that this war was mostly about greed. Iraq wanted control over the Shatt al-Arab River, which is in the border of both countries, but they also wanted control over the Khuzestan zone, which is an Irani-rich oil area. At the same time, the former leader, Saddam Hussein, wanted to gain control to have absolute rule over the Gulf. On the grievance side, we could say that Saddam Hussein was looking to settle scores with Iran due to some inequities brought up by the Algiers Agreement. Also, Iraq was concerned because there were some Islamic opposition groups that had Iran support. There was also a Kurdish genocide that was taking place in Iraq by the government that provoked that these groups started to ally with Iran. However, this was not a cause of war, it was just something that happened because Iraq government was committing a lot of injustices. Such as Cooper and Pugh established, war economies sustaining armed conflict have strong regional dimensions. They thrive on linkages with neighboring states, informal trading networks, transborder kin and ethnic groups, armed traffickers, mercenaries, and rogue commercial actors, each of which may have a vested interest in the prolongation of conflict and instability. In the case of the Iran-Iraq conflict, the war was pretty much financed by other countries, the ones that were already mentioned. Iraq received arms valued at $31.7 billion, while Iran received arms valued in $8.4 billion. Also, Tehran encouraged and supported Islamic and Kurdish groups within Iraq that called for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime. Both countries sustained that what they were doing was necessary. Iraq said that Iran was a threat both to their country and the region, which is why the decision to invade the country was a preemptive measure. On the other side, Iran declared that the war was going to continue until the Ba'athist regime was replaced by an Islamic republic. Also, they said that the war was a righteous jihad and a test of their nation's devotion to Allah. The American presence is usually important in this type of conflicts. In the case of this war, US started with a neutral position, but despite the fact that Iraq was not ideologically compatible with the US, the Americans decided to support it because Iran represented it too great of a threat. It was until they noticed that Iran was beginning to overtake Iraq that they decided to intervene in favor of Iraq and even side with Iraq in some negotiations. The United Nations also had its interventions. In 1994, they were established military inspection teams since both countries violated the Geneva Convention by performing several attacks on civilians. Also, the United Nations intervened by passing the Resolution 598, which called for a ceasefire, and it could be said it was the resolution that ended the conflict. As a peace-building measure, both countries, along with the United Nations, decided to establish the United Nations Iran-Iraq Military Observer Group, also known as the UNIMOG. It worked to verify, confirm, and supervise the cessation of hostilities. Since the war was 8 years long, the United Nations wanted to make sure both countries followed the resolution mentioned earlier. Some other interventions were because Iran and Iraq were attacking each other's oil tanker shippings, which didn't allow the flow of the oil to continue as it used to work, which means that the oil wasn't reaching the rest of the world. As it was already mentioned, this conflict was pretty long and brutal. It left hundreds of thousands of deaths and even had a so-called genocide on the Kurds from the Iraqi government. Both countries violate the Geneva Conventions by performing non-discriminate attacks on several cities, the use of chemical weapons, and a genocide. Due to this, it could be thought that there would have been a response from the international level. However, it did not. Neither the United Nations or other organizations or even other states took action regarding the violations of human rights. In conclusion, in any conflict there are always more than one reason. In the case of the Iraq-Iran War, it could be said that the conflict started because of greed from Iraq. The wanting of more power and more resources from Saddam Hussein started a war that left enormous consequences, but little response from the international arena. It is important to take into account that conflicts like this always have past conflicts or tensions, and in the case of Iran and Iraq, these were classified as identity, even though the conflict per se can be considered as greed.